Bill Maher came prepared to destroy Jonathan Roumie's faith on live television, armed with his usual attacks on the Bible and Christian beliefs. But when the Jesus actor revealed what he'd been secretly doing about Bill for 5 years, America's most famous atheist broke down sobbing in front of 20 million viewers. What Jonathan pulled from his pocket wasn't just personal, it was proof of something that shattered Bill's entire worldview. The confrontation Bill thought he'd win became the lesson that changed his life forever. "You've been doing what?" Bill whispered, staring at the evidence in Jonathan's hands with complete shock. His trademark confidence crumbled as the reality hit him, his voice breaking in disbelief. The studio fell silent, witnessing something far beyond a typical debate about religion. What Jonathan had been doing in secret would teach Bill the most important lesson of his life. 3 hours earlier, Bill Maher had been pacing backstage, reviewing his notes with the predatory excitement of a hunter who had just spotted easy prey. "This is going to be good," he told his producer, waving a stack of research about biblical contradictions and historical inaccuracies. "I've got enough ammunition to expose this Jesus actor for the fraud he probably is." His assistant had warned him that Jonathan Roumie was different from other celebrity guests, more thoughtful and genuine. But Bill dismissed the concern with a wave of his hand. After all, he had been dismantling religious arguments on television for over 2 decades. How hard could it be to handle one actor who played dress up as Jesus? Jonathan Roumie arrived at the studio carrying nothing but his grandfather's old leather Bible and a quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep within. He had prayed that morning not for victory in some televised debate, but for wisdom and compassion. Especially for Bill, whom he had watched struggle with faith and meaning for years. The makeup artist commented on how calm he seemed, unlike most guests who appeared nervous before facing Bill's notorious interrogation style. "I'm not here to win an argument," Jonathan told her gently. "I'm here to share love, and love doesn't need to defend itself. It just needs to be present." As the show's countdown began, Bill felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with the anticipation of a good intellectual fight. He had spent hours preparing what he considered his most devastating questions about biblical mythology, scientific contradictions, and the supposed impossibility of miracles in the modern world. The audience was primed for entertainment, expecting to watch their host systematically dismantle another religious figure with facts, logic, and his trademark wit. But as Jonathan walked onto the stage, something in his demeanor, a combination of humility and unshakable peace, made Bill pause for just a moment. Though he quickly dismissed the feeling. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bill announced with his characteristic confidence, "tonight we have Jonathan Roumie, the actor who plays Jesus in The Chosen, and I'm sure we're going to have a very interesting conversation about faith, facts, and fiction." The audience applauded as Jonathan took his seat, offering a genuine smile and a simple, "Thank you for having me." Bill noticed something he hadn't expected. There was no defensiveness in Jonathan's posture, no preparation for battle, just an open, almost vulnerable presence. That momentarily threw off his prepared attack strategy. The stage was set for what Bill assumed would be an easy victory. But Jonathan's peaceful demeanor suggested this conversation might go in a very different direction than planned. Bill wasted no time launching into his first assault. "So Jonathan, let's cut right to the chase. You make your living pretending to be the Son of God, but surely you don't actually believe in talking snakes, worldwide floods, and people rising from the dead in 2024. The question was designed to corner Jonathan immediately, forcing him to either admit disbelief or defend what Bill considered obvious fairy tales. The audience chuckled, anticipating the familiar rhythm of watching their host dismantle religious belief with scientific reasoning. But Jonathan's response was nothing like what Bill expected. "Bill, I understand why those stories sound impossible," Jonathan said calmly, his voice carrying no trace of offense or defensiveness. "I used to struggle with them too, especially the miracles, because I was looking at them through the wrong lens. I've learned that the Bible isn't a science textbook or a history book in the way we think of them today. It's a love story between God and humanity, and love operates by different rules than physics." Bill's smirk faltered slightly. This wasn't the response he had prepared for. "Come on, Jonathan," Bill pressed, his tone becoming more aggressive as he sensed his initial strategy wasn't landing. You're an intelligent man. Surely you can see that these stories were written by primitive people who didn't understand how the world actually works. Isn't it time we evolved beyond Bronze Age mythology and started living in the real world?" The audience murmured in agreement, but Jonathan's expression remained compassionate, almost sorrowful. As if he was witnessing someone in pain rather than facing an attack, Jonathan reached into his jacket and pulled out his grandfather's worn Bible, its pages yellow with age and handling. "This belonged to my grandfather, who fled religious persecution in Lebanon and came to America with nothing but his faith. And this book," he said, running his fingers over the cracked leather cover. He couldn't read English when he arrived, but he learned by reading these pages over and over again. Bill watched with growing discomfort as Jonathan's story took an unexpectedly personal turn. "He used to tell me that this book wasn't just about ancient history. It was about right now. About how to love people who hate you. How to find hope when everything seems hopeless." "That's a nice story," Bill interrupted, trying to regain control of the conversation. "But personal anecdotes don't make mythology true." His voice carried a slight edge of frustration as he realized Jonathan wasn't taking the bait for a traditional argument. "Look, I get that these stories give people comfort, but shouldn't we base our lives on facts rather than feelings?" The audience nodded, but several people in the front row seemed more interested in hearing Jonathan's response than in applauding Bill's rationalism. Jonathan opened the Bible to a page that was clearly worn, marked with years of reading and reflection. "Bill, what if I told you that I've seen more miracles in the last 5 years than I saw in my entire life before I started playing Jesus?" Jonathan's voice was quiet but carried absolute conviction. Not the kind of miracles that make headlines, but the kind that change hearts. People finding forgiveness for unforgivable things, addicts getting clean after decades of failure, families healing from generational trauma. He looked directly at Bill with eyes that held no judgment, only compassion. "I've watched The Chosen transform lives in ways that can't be explained by good acting or inspirational storytelling alone." But Bill felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Genuine curiosity mixed with an uncomfortable stirring in his chest. "You're talking about psychological effects," Bill countered, but his tone had lost some of its earlier confidence. "People feel better when they have hope, even if that hope is based on illusion. That's basic psychology, not divine intervention." Bill shuffled through his notes, searching for firmer ground to stand on. "The placebo effect can be very powerful, but it doesn't make sugar pills actual medicine." Jonathan nodded thoughtfully, as if he understood Bill's need to rationalize what he was hearing rather than dismissing it outright. "I used to think the same way," Jonathan admitted. "Before I started playing Jesus, I was what you might call a cultural Catholic. I went through the motions, but I didn't really believe much of it was real." He paused, looking down at his hands. "I was actually pretty angry at God for most of my life, especially after my father died when I was young." The admission hung in the air, and Bill found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn into the story despite his skepticism. "But something happened when I started really studying Jesus' words, not just memorizing lines for a script." His voice gained strength. "Not just the miracles, but the teachings about love for enemies, forgiveness, hope." The audience was quieter now, sensing that something unexpected was happening. "For example," Jonathan continued, "Jesus said to love your enemies. I used to think that was just impossible idealism." He looked at Bill with a slight smile. "But then I started trying it, and I discovered that loving people who attack you is actually the most practical thing you can do. It disarms them, it frees you from resentment, and it often changes their hearts." Bill felt an uncomfortable recognition, remembering his own years of carrying anger and resentment like weapons. The Sermon on the Mount isn't just beautiful poetry. It's a manual for human flourishing that actually works when you apply it. "But that's just good philosophy," Bill argued, though with less conviction than before. "You don't need to believe in virgin births and resurrections to live by the golden rule." He was grasping for familiar ground, trying to separate Jesus' teachings from the supernatural claims that had always been his favorite targets. "Plenty of atheists live moral lives without believing in magic." Jonathan nodded again, that same compassionate understanding in his eyes, that beginning to unnerve Bill in ways he couldn't quite articulate. You're absolutely right, Jonathan agreed. Good philosophy is good philosophy regardless of its source. He opened his Bible to another well-marked page. But here's what I discovered. Jesus didn't just teach good philosophy. He lived it perfectly, even when it cost him everything. The simple statement carried weight that Bill felt in his chest. And the resurrection isn't just a historical claim. It's the proof that love really is stronger than death, that hope can triumph over despair, that the way of Jesus actually leads to life. Bill found himself strangely moved by Jonathan's sincerity, even as his rational mind rejected the supernatural claims. I can respect the teachings, he said carefully, but I just can't make the leap to believing in literal miracles. His voice was softer now, less combative. My brain just doesn't work that way. Jonathan leaned forward slightly, and Bill was struck by how much he looked like the Jesus he portrayed. Not physically, but in the quality of attention he gave, the complete absence of judgment in his presence. Bill, can I ask you something personal? Jonathan's voice was gentle, almost tentative. What made you so angry at God? The question landed like a physical blow, and Bill felt his carefully constructed defenses crumble. The audience seemed to sense the shift in the conversation, the atmosphere becoming more intimate. Despite the cameras and lights, Bill's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass, buying time to compose himself. I'm not angry at God, he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. You can't be angry at something that doesn't exist. Jonathan waited in silence for several seconds, letting Bill's words hang in the air. My grandfather used to say that the people who argue most passionately against God are usually the ones who wanted to believe in him the most. He said gently. Disappointment is just love with nowhere to go. Bill felt tears welling up in his eyes, an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in public for decades. The studio was completely silent now, even the cameras seeming to hold their breath. I think maybe you've been hurt by people who claim to represent God, and that's broken your heart in ways you haven't let yourself acknowledge, Jonathan said softly. My mother, Bill whispered, his voice barely audible. She prayed every day for my father to stop drinking, went to church every Sunday, tithing money we didn't have. The words came out in a rush, as if a dam had burst. She believed with everything she had, and God let her down every single day until the day she died. His voice cracked completely, and years of suppressed pain poured out in front of millions of viewers. So yes, maybe I am angry at God. It's because I loved him first, and he didn't show up when we needed him most. Jonathan's eyes filled with tears as he listened to Bill's confession. I'm so sorry, he said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine grief for Bill's pain. Your mother sounds like she was a beautiful woman of faith, and I'm sorry that her prayers seemed to go unanswered. He paused, searching for the right words. But Bill, what if God was showing up in ways you couldn't see? Then the question was asked with such tenderness that it didn't feel like a challenge, but rather like an invitation to consider a different perspective. What do you mean? Bill asked, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. He was past caring about his image or reputation. Something about Jonathan's presence had stripped away all pretense and left him raw and honest. God didn't stop my father from drinking, Bill admitted. He didn't heal my mother's broken heart. He didn't save our family. The pain in his voice was palpable, and several audience members were quietly crying along with him. Jonathan leaned forward, closing the physical distance between them. What if God showed up in your mother's strength to keep loving your father despite his addiction? He asked softly. What if he showed up in her faithfulness to you, in her decision to keep hoping even when hope seemed impossible? His voice was barely above a whisper, but every word carried the weight of absolute conviction. What if God was present in the way she raised a son who would grow up to fight for truth and justice, even if he didn't recognize the source of his passion? Bill stared at him, his mind reeling as he considered this perspective for the first time. And what if, Jonathan continued, his voice growing stronger, God is showing up right now in this conversation, in the way your heart is breaking open to let love in? The studio was completely silent except for the soft sound of people crying. What if he's been waiting all these years for you to be ready to receive the love your mother was trying to give you, the love she believed God had for you? Bill felt something shift inside his chest. a warmth he hadn't experienced since childhood. "What if your anger at God is actually proof that He's real?" Jonathan asked softly. "Because you can't be disappointed by someone who was never there to begin with." Bill sat in stunned silence for several minutes, processing not just Jonathan's words but the emotions they had unleashed. The audience waited respectfully, sensing they were witnessing something sacred. "I never thought about it that way," he finally said, his voice small and wondering. "I always saw God's absence in my pain, but I never looked for His presence." He looked at Jonathan with new eyes, seeing not just an actor but a man who had somehow touched something deep and hidden within him. "How do you know these things? How do you see God everywhere when I can't see Him anywhere?" Jonathan smiled through his own tears. "Because I spent most of my life looking in the wrong places," he said. "I thought God was supposed to be in the big, dramatic moments, the miracles, the answered prayers, the happy endings." He held up his grandfather's Bible again. "But I learned that God lives in the small, quiet moments, in the decision to love when it's hard, in the choice to hope when it seems foolish, in the courage to keep showing up even when you can't see the results." The simplicity of his words carried a profound truth that resonated throughout the studio. "Playing Jesus taught me that God isn't in the lightning bolts and burning bushes." Jonathan continued, his voice gaining strength. "He's in the way Jesus washed His disciples' feet, in the way He forgave people who didn't deserve it, in the way He saw value in people everyone else had written off." He looked directly at Bill. "He's in the way your mother kept loving your father, in the way she raised you to care about justice, in the way you've spent your career fighting for truth, even when it's unpopular." Bill felt something breaking open inside him, a wall he had built around his heart beginning to crumble. "But I've spent my career mocking everything she believed in," Bill said, his voice filled with shame. "I've made jokes about faith, about prayer, about the very things that gave her strength." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. "What kind of son does that make me?" Jonathan reached across the desk and placed his hand gently on Bill's arm, a gesture so natural and compassionate that it didn't seem inappropriate despite their previous adversarial relationship. "It makes you a son who was hurt so deeply that he couldn't see love when it was right in front of him." Jonathan said softly, "Your mother's faith wasn't diminished by your father's addiction. Her prayers weren't unanswered. They were answered in you, in the man you became despite the pain you experienced." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Every time you've stood up for the underdog, every time you've fought against injustice, every time you've used your platform to give voice to the voiceless, you've been living out your mother's prayers." Bill's eyes widened as he began to see connections he had never made before. "Your compassion, your sense of justice, your refusal to let powerful people abuse the powerless. Where do you think those qualities came from?" The realization hit Bill like a physical force. "From her," he whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "She taught me to care about people, to fight for what's right, to never give up on the truth." He looked at Jonathan with growing amazement. "Even when I was rejecting her faith, I was living out her values." Jonathan nodded. His smile was radiant with joy. "Bill, you've been answering your mother's prayers your entire life, without even knowing it." The audience erupted in spontaneous applause, but Bill barely heard it. He was too busy processing the earth-shaking revelation that his life's work had been a testament to faith rather than a rejection of it. "There's something else," Jonathan said quietly, waiting for the applause to die down. "Something I think you need to know." He opened his Bible to a specific page, one that was clearly marked with years of study and reflection. "Before I came on your show tonight, I prayed for wisdom about what to say to you." His voice carried a tremor of emotion, "and I felt God telling me to share something very specific, something I've never told anyone publicly before." Bill leaned forward, sensing that whatever was coming would be significant. "What is it?" Jonathan took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he held the Bible. "The night before I auditioned for The Chosen, I was in my hotel room reading this passage from Matthew 5:44, 'Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you.'" He looked up at Bill with eyes that held both vulnerability and strength. "I was thinking about how impossible that seemed, how I could never love someone who attacked my faith." His voice grew quieter. And then I heard about this comedian who made jokes about Jesus and Christians, and I felt anger rising in my heart." Bill's breath caught as he realized where this story was heading. "I started to pray for that comedian," Jonathan continued, tears streaming down his face. "I prayed that God would soften his heart, that he would find the peace he was looking for, that he would discover he was loved beyond measure." I paused, struggling to continue. "I prayed for Bill Maher every night for 5 years. The studio fell into absolute silence, and Bill felt as if the ground had shifted beneath him. "You prayed for me," he whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. "Even when I was mocking everything you believed in, especially then," Jonathan said, his voice breaking with emotion. "Because I knew that hurt people, and I could see the pain behind your anger." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn piece of paper. "I wrote your name in my prayer journal over 1-800 times. He handed the paper to Bill, who took it with trembling hands. "I never imagined I'd actually meet you. But I kept praying because I believed God loved you and wanted to heal your heart." Bill stared at the paper, seeing his name written in Jonathan's handwriting, date after date, year after year. The emotion in the studio was overwhelming as audience members realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. "You've been praying for me for 5 years," Bill repeated, his voice filled with wonder and disbelief. "All those times I made jokes about Jesus. All those times I attacked people like you, and you were praying for me." Jonathan nodded, unable to speak through his tears. "If you're still watching this incredible moment unfold, if you believe that love can overcome years of hurt and hatred, go ahead and hit that like button and comment the word forgiveness below. Let's see how many of us still believe that prayer can change the hardest hearts." "But why?" Bill asked, his voice breaking. "Why would you do that for someone who was your enemy?" The question hung in the air. Jonathan's answer would change everything. "Because that's what Jesus did," Jonathan said simply. "He prayed for the people who crucified him, loved the people who rejected him, blessed the people who cursed him." His voice grew stronger despite his tears. "And if he could do that for his executioners, I could do that for a comedian who was just trying to make sense of a world that hurt him." He looked at Bill with infinite compassion. "Besides, you were never my enemy. You were my brother who just couldn't see it yet." The truth of those words hit Bill like a lightning bolt, shattering every defensive wall he had built around his heart. "This is impossible," Bill whispered, staring at the prayer journal page. "This changes everything. I thought I knew about faith, about God, about myself." He looked up at Jonathan with tears streaming down his face. "You're telling me that while I was attacking your beliefs, you were loving me?" Jonathan nodded, his own tears flowing freely. "That's the gospel, Bill. It's not about being good enough or smart enough or faithful enough. It's about being loved, in spite of ourselves, loved when we don't deserve it, loved when we can't even see it." The cameras captured the moment when 23 years of atheistic certainty crumbled in real time. "I don't know what to do with this," Bill said, his voice small and vulnerable. "I've built my entire career on being the guy who doesn't believe, the guy who asks the hard questions, the guy who sees through religious nonsense." He looked around the studio as if seeing it for the first time. "But how do I argue with love like this? How do I rationalize away someone praying for me for 5 years? Jonathan leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to rationalize it. You just have to receive it." "Bill," Jonathan said, "what if everything you've been looking for, the meaning, the purpose, the hope, has been right here all along?" He held up the Bible, its worn pages catching the studio lights. "What if the love you've been seeking is the same love your mother tried to show you? The same love that's been pursuing you through every joke, every doubt, every moment of pain?" The question reverberated through the studio, and Bill felt something fundamental shifting inside him. "What if coming home to God isn't about admitting you were wrong?" Jonathan asked softly. "But about realizing you were loved all along?" The transformation was visible on Bill's face as years of defensive skepticism gave way to wonder. "I can feel it," he whispered, his voice filled with amazement. "I can actually feel something changing inside me." He looked at Jonathan with new eyes, seeing not just a man but a messenger of grace. "Is this what people mean when they talk about being born again?" Jonathan's smile was radiant as he nodded. It's the moment when you stop running from love and start running toward it, he said. It's when you realize that faith isn't about believing impossible things. It's about trusting that you're impossibly loved. I want to know more, Bill said, his voice stronger now despite the tears. I want to understand what my mother saw, what she believed. What gave her such strength? He looked at the Bible in Jonathan's hands with curiosity instead of skepticism. Will you teach me? The question sent ripples of shock through the audience. Bill Maher, the famous atheist, asking to learn about faith. Jonathan's response was immediate and wholehearted. It would be my honor, he said. But Bill, I'm not going to teach you. We're going to discover together, because I'm still learning too. There's one more thing, Jonathan added, his voice trembling with emotion. Something I need you to know about your mother. He opened his Bible to a passage heavily underlined and annotated. The last thing I prayed for you was that you would understand how much she loved you, and how her love was a reflection of God's love. He looked at Bill with eyes that seemed to see into his soul. I believe she's watching this right now, and she's rejoicing because her prayers have finally been answered. Not the way she expected, but in the way God knew was perfect. The silence that followed was sacred, filled with the presence of healing and hope. Bill sat quietly for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what had just happened. She would be proud, he said finally, his voice filled with wonder. She would be so proud to know that her son finally understood. He looked at Jonathan with gratitude that seemed to glow from within. Thank you for seeing what I couldn't see, for loving me when I didn't know I needed it, for praying for me when I thought I was beyond help. The transformation was complete. The angry skeptic had become a seeker. The mocker had become a student. The enemy had become a brother. Jonathan pulled out his phone and showed Bill something that made him gasp. I want to show you the last entry I made in my prayer journal before coming here tonight, he said. The screen showed a note dated that very day. God, I'm going to meet Bill tonight. Help me love him the way you love him. Help him see himself the way you see him. Help him come home. Bill stared at the words, overwhelmed by the realization that his life had been forever changed by someone who had loved him long before they met. You really believed this would happen? He asked, his voice filled with awe. You had faith that God would answer your prayers. Jonathan's response was simple. I had faith that love always wins. I had faith that truth is stronger than lies, that hope is more powerful than despair, that grace is greater than condemnation. He looked at Bill with eyes that sparkled with joy. And I had faith that the same God who transformed my life could transform yours, because he's in the business of making all things new. The studio erupted in applause. But this time it wasn't for entertainment. It was for witnessing a miracle of grace, a testament to the power of persistent love and faithful prayer. Bill joined the applause, clapping not for himself but for the God he was finally ready to meet. In the months that followed, Bill's life became a testament to the transformative power of grace. He began each day reading the Bible Jonathan had given him, his own copy of the same text his mother had treasured. His comedy evolved from mockery to wonder, from cynicism to hope, from tearing down to building up. The angry atheist who had built his career on attacking faith became one of its most compelling advocates. Not through arguments, but through the simple power of his transformed life. His mother's prayers, planted in tears and watered with hope, had finally bloomed in ways she never could have imagined. Jonathan and Bill became close friends, meeting weekly to study scripture and pray together. Their friendship became a powerful example of how enemies can become brothers, how hurt can become healing, how doubt can become faith. Bill often spoke about how his mother's love had been preparing him for this moment his entire life, how her prayers had been building a bridge between his heart and God's, that he finally found the courage to cross. The man who had once mocked the idea of answered prayer became living proof that God's timing is perfect, even when it takes decades to unfold. If you're watching this and you've been running from God, maybe it's time to consider that he's not running from you. Maybe, like Bill, you've been hurt by people who claim to represent God, and that pain has blinded you to his love. Maybe someone has been praying for you, even when you couldn't hope for yourself. The same God who transformed Bill Maher's heart is waiting to transform yours. Not because you're good enough, but because you're loved enough. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced unexpected love when you least deserved it? And if you want more stories of how God shows up in surprising places, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. Will you let Him love you?